Welcome back to the Nietzsche, Krishna, Buddha, Christ series. This is the third video in the series. I'm going over the paper, Nietzsche, Krishna, Buddha, Christ, Part 1, a key to Nietzsche's riddles in the birth of tragedy. And then the third subtitle is Heracles equals Krishna, Dionysus equals Shiva. All right, so in the previous two videos, in the first video, I went over the overall strategy that I say Nietzsche had from his first book to his last. His first book is The Birth of Tragedy. Then in the second video, I summarized what I will be going over specifically in The Birth of Tragedy. So in this third video, I'm going to start getting down into the nuts and bolts of The Birth of Tragedy. I'll be discussing sections 1 and 4 of The Birth of Tragedy, where in section 1, Nietzsche talks about Apollo. He equates Apollo, quoting Schopenhauer, with the veil of Maya. And then he also talks about, he uses a sexual metaphor, a reproductive metaphor, to discuss the combination of Dionysus and Apollo. So Dionysus and Apollo are the Greek gods. They're brother gods, sons of Zeus. And I am saying that the solution to the riddle in The Birth of Tragedy that Nietzsche hid and implied that he did hide a riddle in the attempt at a self-criticism, which I went over in the first video. He was imitating the Alexandria-era Greeks, specifically Megasthenes, the historian, the 4th century B.C.E. historian in India, who started the habit of equating Greek with Indian gods. So when they encountered the gods of India, and the two main deities were Krishna and Shiva, Megasthenes equated Krishna with Heracles and Shiva with Dionysus. And I'm saying that is what Nietzsche did in The Birth of Tragedy without announcing it. So when he mentions Heracles, he means Krishna. When he mentions Shiva, when he mentions Dionysus, he means Shiva. So evidence for that he means Shiva when he says Dionysus, comes from sections 1 and 4, where he talks about Apollo. So to understand Dionysus, you have to understand Apollo. And he equates Apollo with the veil of Maya. Maya is Shiva's wife. So we'll get into that. And then I'll be discussing sections, so that's sections 1 and 4. And then I'll be discussing sections 18 and 20. So in section 18, Nietzsche equates tragic culture. This is all, he's analyzing the tragic plays of ancient Greece, the Dionysian plays performed in honor of the god Dionysus. He equates tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture, which is strange. Walter Kaufman and Douglas Smith, the two translations that I referred to in the paper, both say this is weird that he did that. Why would he equate the tragic culture of Greece historically with Indian Brahmanic culture? So that's section 18. And then in section 20, he says that we should follow modern Europeans, which means that the Western world generally should follow the Dionysian pageant from India to Greece. Believe in the miracles of your God. Prepare yourselves for hard strife. So he's urging the Western Christian world or post-Christian world to follow this Dionysian pageant from India to Greece, and he's equating it with Indian Brahmanic culture, and you should be chanting the names of God, Dionysus. But Dionysus is just a mask, he says, in the attempt at a self-criticism, and I'm saying Dionysus is a mask for Shiva. So then in sections 10 and 19, which is the third thing we'll be examining in this video, we'll see when Nietzsche mentions Heracles. He only mentions Heracles 3 times in the whole book, twice in section 10, and then again in section 19. But when he does mention Heracles, you'll see that he mentions Heracles in conjunction with Dionysus in such a way that Dionysus is a subordinate expansion of Heracles. So Heracles and Dionysus represent the relationship between Krishna and Shiva. Shiva is Krishna's shadow side. You can't have one of these deities without the other. So everyone has a conscious mind, and we have a subconscious mind. To use Jungian psychological terms, the shadow side everyone has. You have your conscious ego, and then you have a shadow side. Similarly, Krishna is the conscious side, the supreme personality of Godhead, and then his shadow is Shiva. living in Krishna's dream. In this, we live in a megaverse of parallel universes which are exhaling out from and inhaling back into Krishna's Mahavishnu's, the skin pores of Mahavishnu. So Krishna is the original Vishnu. There's many other forms of Vishnu, including the three Purusha avatars who create the cosmic megaverse of universes. So I'll also be talking about that. So there's a lot to cover. I could break it into separate parts, but each one of these parts augments the other. So when, for example, he calls tragic culture Indian Brahmanic culture, well, that makes it a lot more plausible to suggest that when he mentions Heracles and Dionysus, he means Krishna and Shiva. So I'm going to try to go over this more quickly, but just to reiterate the main point, what was Nietzsche trying to do in The Birth of Tragedy? He's calling for this cultural revival, a rebirth of the tragic culture of Greece. But then he equates it with Indian Brahmanic culture. Ultimately, I'm saying he was influenced by the theory, which was very popular in the second half of the 19th century in Europe. It started in 1788, even earlier than that, but in 1788, Sir William Jones mentioned these parallels between Krishna and Christ. So I talked about that at length in the previous two videos, and I'll be talking about it more thoroughly in forthcoming papers and the videos related to them. But I'm arguing that Nietzsche, born a Lutheran pastor's son and the grandson of two other Lutheran pastors, and there were other Lutheran pastors in his family. So he's basically in this priestly caste, this Prussian priestly caste, Brahminical type of austerity of these Lutheran Christian pastors. At age 20, he gave up his faith in Christ and God, even though at age 17 he had a mystical experience with his friend Paul Deussen at their confirmation ceremony, and he believed in God all the way up to the age of 20. I'm saying that after he discovered Arthur Schopenhauer, 6 months after renouncing God and Christ, he became enamored with the Vedanta philosophy of India. Subsequently, I'm saying he learned about the Krishna Buddha Christ theory, that the scriptures of Buddha and Christ were based on the older scriptures of Krishna, and that it enabled him to come back to Christianity while still embracing the Vedanta philosophy of India. So chanting the names of Krishna in the streets is how Nietzsche intended to save the downward spiraling culture of the Western world. And I'm saying his prediction and his request for this congregational dancing and singing for Krishna came true 100 years later when His Divine Grace A.C. Bhakti Vedanta Swami Prabhupada brought the Hare Krishna movement from India to the United States, and then from the United States to Europe and all around the world. So the Hare Krishna movement is actually a branch of the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta. So I thought, before I start reading the details here, I wanted to just skip ahead to another paper that I will be putting out, where I'm examining the philological information that was available to Nietzsche at the time. Could he have learned about Chaitanya and the Vaishnava reformers who followed Shankara? So in the previous videos, I talked about Shankara. Schopenhauer's understanding of Vedanta philosophy was based mainly on Shankara's 8th century monistic Advaita interpretation of Vedanta. So the two sides of the soul in Vedanta philosophy are Atman, the individual personal soul, and Brahman, the impersonal ocean of potential being. And Shankara advised merging the Atman into Brahman, like a salt doll returning to the ocean. So I am saying then after Shankara came the Vaishnava reformers, starting in the 12th century with Ramanuja and culminating in the 16th century with Chaitanya, who said, no, the Atman too is real, and there is a God. We're all little Atmans, there's a supreme Atman. We can have a personal relationship with God, even though the flip side of reality, the complementarity relationship of Atman has with Brahman, I also discussed in previous videos, that we're both. We're inconceivably, simultaneously one with and different than God, says Chaitanya. So let me read here from Sir Monier Williams. So this is an English Sanskrit philologist. In 1883, he wrote here, it is to be observed, too, that as often as pantheistic and polytheistic ideas have been pushed to preposterous extremes in India, a reaction has always taken place towards simple monotheism. The Vaishnava reformers of the 12th, 13th, 15th, and 16th centuries inculcated a doctrine which was an approximation towards the Christian idea of God's unity and personality, as set forth in the first article of the Church of England. Ramanuja, Madhava, Vallabha, and Chaitanya all, as we have seen, taught the existence of one supreme personal God of infinite power, wisdom, and goodness, the maker and preserver of all things, a God whom they called Vishnu, and whom they believed to be distinct from the human soul and the material world. He also says, Monier Williams, that it is noteworthy that just about the time that Luther was agitating the minds of men in Europe, Chaitanya was stirring the hearts of the people of Bengal. So Nietzsche, the son of a Lutheran pastor, were he to get wind of the idea that in India, at the same time as Martin Luther was starting the Protestant Reformation, Chaitanya was in India inciting people to chant Hare Krishna in the streets ecstatically, while beating on drums and cymbals. That was the Hare Krishna movement that Srila Prabhupada brought to the West in the 1960s and 70s, and that, I'm saying, fulfilled Nietzsche's prophecy. So it just gives you a greater historical context. What's the goal? What was Nietzsche really ultimately trying to do? And I'm going to read a little bit more here. Here is from the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal in an 1880 article. So this is the information that was available to Nietzsche. This is 1880, so that's 8 years after he published The Birth of Tragedy, but this kind of information was available even before Nietzsche started writing his book. So this is from that, the Journal of the Asiatic Society of Bengal, Volume 1. Oh, this is the Roman numerals, XLII. So in the 15th and 16th centuries, Vaishnavism gave an impetus to the cultivation of literature in Bengal. Chaitanya, who was born in Nudia, was a bold reformer. He denounced caste and taught universal love. He had able coadjutors in Nityananda and Advaita, and able disciples in Rupa and Sanatanan. So he goes on, but the point is, knowledge of Chaitanya's movement was known to the European Sanskrit philologists. Nietzsche was friends with one of the most prominent European Sanskrit philologists, Paul Deussen. Paul Deussen was the student of other important Sanskrit philologists like Christian Lassen and Albrecht Weber, who wrote about the Krishna-Christ parallels. So it is not off-the-wall crazy to suggest that Nietzsche was aware of Chaitanya's movement and wanted people in the West to embrace it, just as people in India had at his time 400 years earlier. Now it's 500 years earlier. So denouncing caste. Chaitanya did not denounce caste, but during the congregational singing and dancing for Krishna, he did. Everybody, regardless of caste or sex or species even, should join in this congregational chanting of the Hare Krishna mantra. And that is how you can defeat the effects of sin in Kali Yuga, this age of sin. All right, so with that, I now want to read, this is Nietzsche. So I'm going to read about the way he describes this Dionysian chanting and how it unites everybody with the underlying unity of all being. So here's just his vision, and it's similar to the descriptions of Chaitanya's ecstatic mass movement of chanting Hare Krishna in India. So I'm just going to read here quickly, and it's going to give a little picture from Nietzsche's book, The Birth of Tragedy. I didn't put this in the paper because the paper I tried to keep as terse and short as possible. But to give a flavor of what he's talking about here, let me read. This is from Douglas Smith's translation. I predominantly use Walter Kaufmann's, but when Nietzsche mentions Maya, I use this because he capitalizes Maya like Nietzsche did in the original. Kaufmann uses a small m. It's important that he capitalizes as Maya because Maya is the goddess Maya, the wife of Shiva. But anyway, let me read here a little bit. This is page 22, section 1. Under the spell of the Dionysian, it is not only the bond between man and man which is reestablished. Nature in its estranged, hostile, or subjugated forms also celebrates its reconciliation with its prodigal son, man. The earth voluntarily gives up its spoils while the predators of cliffs and deserts approach meekly. Chaitanya would chant through the jungles and tigers would come out and join the chanting. So this is similar to what Nietzsche's describing. He's describing Dionysian chanting as described in the tragic plays, but I think in his mind he also had in mind perhaps Chaitanya's movement itself. So the chariot of Dionysus overflows with flowers and wreaths. Beneath its yoke tread the panther and the tiger. If one were to allow one's imagination free rein in transforming Beethoven's hymn to joy into a painting, particularly the moment when the multitudes kneel down, awestruck in the dust, then one might come close to an idea of the Dionysian. Now the slave is a free man. Now all the inflexible and hostile divisions which necessity, caprice, or impudent fashion have established between men collapse. Now with the gospel of world harmony, each man feels himself not only reunified, reconciled, reincorporated, and merged with his neighbor, but genuinely one, as if the veil of Maya had been rent, and only its shreds still fluttered in front of the mysterious original unity. Okay, so the mysterious original unity, that is the will, Brahman. So Atman's the personal individual soul. Brahman is the infinite expanse of precognitive bliss, the potential for Atmans to manifest. They're in a complementarity. Complementarity is when two things are mutually exclusive but complementary, like the particle and wave nature of subatomic particles according to quantum mechanics. All right, but now I want to get back to the details of this paper. That was an overview of what Nietzsche's trying to advocate here. So I just want to, here's 1852, Christian Lassen, Indische Altertumskunde, Indian Classical Studies. Here's what he wrote. It, according to the testimony of Megasthenes, the Indian Dionysus or Shiva was worshipped by the mountain dwellers. The Indian Heracles or Krishna, on the other hand, was worshipped mainly by the inhabitants of the plains. That's volume 2. Nietzsche borrowed volume 1 of Lassen's work in 1867 and 68, a year before he started writing The Birth of Tragedy. I quote this sentence from volume 2 because it's so concise, but he mentions it throughout volumes 1 and 2. And to read Lassen's book, I used the Google Translator. So it's in German, and then I would highlight certain paragraphs. I would search for terms. It was a painstaking process, but I was very happy when I discovered this. I already knew about, from Joseph Campbell, that the Greeks were equating Heracles and Krishna and Dionysus with Shiva, but I wasn't sure. I assumed Nietzsche would have known that, and then when I discovered that he read Christian Lassen, and I discovered what Lassen said, I said, okay, that's it, that he did know about it, and that bolsters this idea that this is the solution to the riddle that he hid in The Birth of Tragedy. All right, so with that, we're going to start. Now, I have in the paper, I begin with an introduction, an overall view of Nietzsche's plan, and now on page 16 at the very bottom, so section 1, Dionysus equals Shiva, Apollo equals Maya. So I say, strong support for my theory that Nietzsche secretly equates Dionysus with Shiva comes from the fact that in the first section of The Birth of Tragedy, citing Schopenhauer, Nietzsche openly equates Dionysus's brother, Apollo, with the veil of Maya, the illusory power of Vishnu's dream, which is the material world. Now here's the quote from Nietzsche, section 1, The Birth of Tragedy. And so what Schopenhauer says about man caught in the veil of Maya might apply to Apollo in an eccentric sense. So I don't go on to quote what he says about that, but I will now read it here. So after he says that man caught in the veil of Maya might apply to Apollo in an eccentric sense, then he quotes from World as Will and Representation, Volume 1. Here's how Apollo and Maya are similar. In fact, says Schopenhauer. Is he quoting Schopenhauer here? Yes, he is. Okay. As a sailor sits in a small boat in a boundless raging sea, surrounded on all sides by the heaving mountainous waves, trusting in his frail vessel, so does the individual man sit calmly in the middle of a world of torment, trusting to the principium individuationis. The principium individuationis, the principle of individuality. That's the veil of Maya. That's Apollo. Dionysus is the heaving waves of will, the universal will. That's Brahman. Nietzsche does not explicitly equate the will with Brahman, but he does explicitly equate Apollo with the veil of Maya. And he does explicitly equate the waves of will with Dionysus. And I'm saying, therefore, if Apollo's the veil of Maya, and Maya is Shiva's wife, and Megasthenes called Dionysus Shiva, and Nietzsche was aware of that, that makes it plausible to suggest that when Nietzsche was saying Dionysus, he meant Shiva, especially when we remember in the Attempt at a Self-Criticism, sections 3 and 5 and 7 in particular, where he says that Dionysus is just a mask for some other unknown god, and that's the riddle. What is the name of the god whom Nietzsche referred to as Dionysus? It makes sense to say Shiva. I'm remembering all the complexity about it. In his later books, Nietzsche conflated Heracles and Apollo in Dionysus. He stopped mentioning Heracles and Apollo. He only mentioned Dionysus. That Dionysus of the later books, including the Attempt at a Self-Criticism, equals Krishna and Shiva's wife Maya. But in the Birth of Tragedy, Heracles equals Krishna, Dionysus equals Shiva, and Apollo equals Maya. All right, so then Nietzsche goes on in section 1 to say Apollo and Dionysus represent respectively the separate art worlds of dreams and intoxication. So dreams, that's the veil of Maya. Dreams have individual forms, and intoxication is when the world of individual forms melts down. So, and he equates the veil of Maya in section 18 with space, time, and causality, the Kantian a priori categories of thought, space, time, and causality. So responding to David Hume, who was the British empiricist, who said if you can't perceive it with one of your 5 sense organs, it's just a product of your imagination, Immanuel Kant said, oh, you've awoke me from my dogmatic slumber. That's a wonderful insight. However, what about this? And Hume was aware of it. Space and time and the idea of cause and effect, those are not empirically observable. You can't see, smell, taste, touch, or hear space or time or chains of causality. And yet every single sense perception we have is automatically organized in our minds by these lenses of cognition, these unconscious, pre-existing psychological filters to create the world of individual forms that we perceive. Apollo equals the veil of Maya, who creates the individual forms that we perceive in space and time, and that these individual forms are related in causal relationships. That's an illusion. That's the veil of Maya. And this is something Schopenhauer picked up on, and Schopenhauer is the one who equated Kant's a priori categories of thought with the veil of Maya, synthesizing Western and Eastern philosophy. So then I quote here from Mircea Eliade, or I don't even know how to pronounce his name, but Eliade, A History of Religious Ideas, where he talks about the complementarity between Krishna and Shiva. But I'm not going to read that because we've got so much on our plate. I want to focus just on the Birth of Tragedy here. So in section 1, Apollo equals the veil of Maya. And then Apollo equals the god of dreams, of individual forms. Dreams create individual forms. And so does the veil of Maya while we're awake. Just like when you're asleep, there's a whole world of individual forms relating with each other that's created. It's illusory. Similarly, while we're awake, the world of forms that we think are real are created for us by the categories of thought. It's just another level of a dream. And that's important because according to the Vaishnava branch of Hinduism, the entire universe, or the megaverse of universes, is Vishnu's dream. All right, so on page 19, I'd say, according to Nietzsche, one side of reality manifests as dreams, represented by Apollo in the veil of Maya, who oversees the principium individuationis. The other side of reality manifests as intoxication, represented by Dionysus, the god of wine, whom Nietzsche presents as the will personified. Dionysian intoxication obliterates borders between individuals in an all-embracing spirit of Bacchic enthusiasm, within the most intense throes of which all pretense of personal space is devoured back into the ravenous ground of being, the voracious vacuum from which the dream of distinct forms temporarily erupts. So that's the Dionysian. So too much Dionysian revelry wrecks society, and these orgies of Dionysian, the loss of individuality and just merging in an orgiastic expression of universal desire. Apollo is the god of individual forms and restraint and soberness. And when you unite these two, you come up with the Greek tragic plays, says Nietzsche. So for Nietzsche, the ultimate state of psychic health is a union of the Apollonian and Dionysian sides of nature, which was achieved most spectacularly in the Greek art form of Attic tragedy in the 5th century B.C.E., which featured whole throngs of Apollonian egos, Atman, rejoicing ecstatically through song and dance as timeless servants of their god. That's a quote. Timeless servants of their god. Dionysus. That's in section 8. The universal will personified. So timeless servants of their god. That is how Nietzsche said that the chorus and the spectators observing these tragic plays featuring masked actors, all of whom who represent the god Dionysus, and sometimes the god Dionysus was represented by an actor wearing a mask of the god himself. The power of the music could transform these clumsy masked actors into the archetype that they represented. And we're going to get into that. But timeless servants of their god, that's the essence of Chaitanya's movement and Bhakti Yoga. Krishna in the Bhagavad-Gita, he tells Arjuna, just surrender unto me, serve me with love, and then everything will be fine. And Schopenhauer talks about the Bhagavad-Gita, and Nietzsche alludes to those sections of Schopenhauer's book where he does talk about the Bhagavad-Gita, as we'll talk about in another video. But this is the essence of it all, serving God with a loving spirit of compassion for the suffering of the God. That is the essence, the highest level of cultural achievement, says Nietzsche, which we should re-embrace in the modern world. And I'm saying he's really referring to the congregational singing and dancing for Krishna, which Chaitanya spread in Bengal and then throughout India in the 16th century. So I quote here, what differentiates, or I don't quote, this is what I'm saying, what differentiates Nietzsche's philosophy and the birth of tragedy from Schopenhauer's the most is his emphasis on the importance of the loving and compassionate service attitude of the tragic chorus for their God, to which I will return later. All right, so the veil of Maya, that's a big one. But was Nietzsche really thinking about Dionysus and his wife Maya, the goddess Maya, also known as Shakti and Durga and Sati and many other names? Was he really thinking of that marriage, of this archetype of the male and female in the material megaverse of universes? Evidence that he was comes from the very first sentence of the first section of his book, where he says that, quote, the continuous development of art is bound up with the Apollonian and Dionysian duality. Just as procreation depends on the duality of the sexes, involving perpetual strife, with only periodically intervening reconciliations. So these are brother gods. And yet in the very first sentence of the whole book, he talks about the duality of the sexes and procreation. Why would you talk about procreative relationships and sexual relationships between two brothers? So in section 4, he repeats the sexual metaphor again. So here's a quote. Up to this point, we have simply enlarged upon the observation made at the beginning of this essay that the Dionysian and the Apollonian, in new births, ever following and mutually augmenting one another, controlled the Hellenic genius. Hellenic refers to Greece. And here the sublime and celebrated art of Attic tragedy and the dramatic dithyramb presents itself as the common goal of both these tendencies, whose mysterious union after many long precursory struggles found glorious consummation in this child, at once Antigone and Cassandra. So I'm focusing just on the fact that Dionysus and Apollo had a child together. So in sections 21, 22, and 24, Nietzsche speaks about the fraternal union. That's a quote between Apollo and Dionysus. So why in sections 1 and 4 does he refer to this reproductive sexual relationship between them? I'm saying because when he mentions Dionysus, he really secretly means Shiva, and he openly equates Apollo with the veil of Maya. So it's not hard to say he's equating Apollo with the goddess Maya, who is the source of the veil of Maya. So Douglas Smith, in his translation, here's what he says. in his introduction to his translation of The Birth of Tragedy, says, in fact, the birth of tragedy itself, as described at the very beginning of the book, seems less the product of a female womb than the impossible child of a homosexual union between Apollo and Dionysus. Nietzsche's use of gendered language points once again to the problem of origins, as well as suggesting a homoerotic subtext shared with other elements of the German Hellenist tradition, notably in the work of Winckelmann. So I looked it up. Who is Winckelmann? Johann Joachim Winckelmann, an archaeologist and art historian. So he was gay, and I guess he kind of alluded or exposed, if you read Plato's dialogues, homosexuality was openly embraced in ancient Athens, and that's what Nietzsche's talking about. So Smith is saying maybe Nietzsche was kind of alluding to Winckelmann's tradition, and I'm saying maybe he was, but more fundamentally, the gendered language and the sexual relationship between Apollo and Dionysus is his hint, his flag to say, I'm not really talking about Dionysus and Apollo, I'm talking about Shiva and Maya, and the entire Vedanta philosophy associated with that, which he believed Jesus Christ himself secretly embraced. And so now Christendom in this post-Christian era should re-embrace the original source of Christianity by chanting Krishna's names in the street. So that is it for section 1. So section 2, the birth of tragedy, section 18 and 20. Tragic culture equals Indian Brahmanic culture. All right, so in section 18, Nietzsche talks about how the universal will compels more sensitive, noble individuals to continue living despite the horrors of life with 3 stages of illusion. So here's a quote, section 18, the birth of tragedy. One is chained by the Socratic love of knowledge and the delusion of being able thereby to heal the eternal wound of existence. Another is ensnared by art's seductive veil of beauty fluttering before his eyes. Still another by the metaphysical comfort that beneath the whirl of phenomena, eternal life flows on indestructibly. So the metaphysical comfort, the whirl of phenomena is the forms that we perceive through the categories of thought, space-time, and causality. It's a word Kant used. It's Maya. Phenomena is Maya. Noumena is the thing in itself, the underlying thing in itself, which can't be perceived directly because we can only perceive it filtered through the a priori categories of thought or the veil of Maya. So those 3 stages of illusion. When a person who's more sensitive to the suffering of existence starts to feel like life isn't worth living, the will lures that person back into continuing with one of 3 powerful illusions, the Socratic love of knowledge, so that science, existence is filled with suffering, but knowledge, science, using reason, we can heal that and solve all the suffering in the world. That's one illusion that drives people, specifically in our age, says Nietzsche. Another is ensnared by art's seductive veil. So this is an ugly and horrible suffering world. Behold the beauty of the artistic world. Counteract the ugliness with artistic beauty. And then finally, others are given a metaphysical comfort because they say, oh yes, it's a suffering world. People are born, they get sick, they get old, they die. There's all kinds of injustice. But this is just the world of phenomena, the veil of Maya. Underlying that is this eternal life. And that gives a metaphysical comfort. So then, depending on the proportions of those 3 stages of life-saving illusion, we have, says Nietzsche, this is a quote, we have a predominantly Socratic or artistic or tragic culture. Or if I may avail myself of historical examples, either an Alexandrian or a Hellenic or an Indian Brahmanic culture. So Socratic culture is Alexandrian culture. Artistic culture is Hellenic, which is Greece. Tragic culture, which was also in Greece, nevertheless, the historical exemplification that Nietzsche points to is Indian Brahmanic culture. Huge piece of evidence for my theory. Why would Nietzsche equate tragic culture of Greece historically with Indian Brahmanic culture? That just seems very strange. And then later we'll see in section 20, he says we should follow the Dionysian pageant from India to Greece. So he's putting tragic culture in India. And if tragic culture is exemplified by Indian Brahmanic culture, then the gods of Greek tragedies would be exemplified by the gods of Indian Brahmanic culture, specifically the two main ones being Krishna and Shiva. So when we know that Nietzsche knew that Megasthenes equated Heracles with Krishna and Dionysus with Shiva, that makes it all the more likely that that's what Nietzsche was thinking about when he equated tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture. And then that would mean when he mentions Heracles, he means Krishna, the supreme Indian Brahmanic god. And when he mentions Dionysus, he means Shiva, and he already equates Apollo with Maya. All right, so that's a big piece. In the footnote, I explain that originally, in his 1872 version, he equated tragic culture with Indian Buddhist culture. And then he corrected that in the second edition of 1874. He crossed it out with his own pencil and he put in the word Brahmanic, replacing Buddhistic. It does not make sense for Nietzsche to equate tragic culture with Buddhistic culture, because in section 7, he says the whole point of tragic culture was to save the sensitive Greeks from the danger of succumbing to a Buddhistic negation of the will. And he repeats that warning in section 21 and in Attempt at a Self-Criticism in the very first section, section 1 of that. So it does make sense to equate tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture because, according to Christian Lassen, the Brahmins of India in the 5th century BC inflated the older myth of Krishna, who was a minor character in the Mahabharata, into the supreme form of Vishnu, specifically to counteract the spread of Buddhism. Now, I believe Nietzsche believed that the Brahmins did promote the religion of Krishna to counteract Buddhism, but I don't think Nietzsche believed that the Brahmins invented the myth. I believe Nietzsche believed that Krishna is the eternal form of God, and that the Brahmins weren't just creating noble lies to rule over the people, but that they believed it themselves. But at any rate, the point that he did agree with is that the Brahmins promoted the worship of Krishna to counteract the spread of a Buddhistic negation of the will. So Buddhists say there is no Atman, there's no individual soul. There's just this unconnected series of sense impressions. It's very similar to David Hume, the British empiricist whom I talked about earlier, and that we should let go of the illusion of an individual form, and then the desires that accompany this individual form will slowly dry up, and then that's how you escape suffering. The Four Noble Truths of Buddhism have to deal with how do you escape suffering. And the bottom line is, you don't exist. You think that you're this continuous, eternally existing individual, but you're not. All you are is this kind of temporary whirlpool of sense perceptions and desires and memories, and when you realize that, it begins to fade away. And then you enter nirvana. What is nirvana? Buddha doesn't really tell you what it is. He says, if someone shot you with a poisoned arrow, and the doctor comes to take it out, would you sit there and say, oh no, first I want to know who shot me and what was the poison made of, what kind of bird did the feathers for the quill come from? No, by then you die. Just let the doctor remove the poisonous arrow of suffering. Don't ask so many questions. I believe Nietzsche was not satisfied with that answer, and that he did believe in eternal individual souls and the supreme form of God. Oh, are they illusions? Maybe they are illusions, but they're eternal illusions, and there's this fundamental part of the Vedanta philosophy of the Vaishnavas. Yes, Maya. This is the material world. It's Maya, space-time and causality. It's an illusion. But this eternal spiritual world is also ruled by Maya, Yoga Maya. So Maha Maya is the material illusion. Yoga Maya is the spiritual illusion. If you want a world without illusion, that's as much as to say I want a world without subjective perspective. Okay, Brahman, there you go. It's objectively true. There's no subjective perspective in it at all. But if you want subjective interpersonal relationships, that goes hand in hand with Maya. But in the spiritual world, it's eternal. So I remember once at the University of Hawaii, I was working in this Govinda's food trailer, and I was just talking to a friend, and someone overheard it and was interested by the question. I asked my friend Chad, what's the difference between the eternal truth and an eternal illusion? If they're both eternal, it's an eternal fact of existence. So there's so many complexities of this philosophy, but let me get back on track here. So Nietzsche equates tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture in section 18. And so here I quote here from Beyond Good and Evil, the penultimate section. That's in the first video when I went over attempted self-criticism, where Nietzsche says there's a riddle in the birth of tragedy. He said it also in Beyond Good and Evil, the second to last section. He says, I have found no one who understood what I was doing when he sacrificed in all secrecy and reverence my firstborn, the birth of tragedy. And then elsewhere in that section, he says, for today, as I have been told, you no longer like to believe in God and gods. Nietzsche's saying to his audience, implying that he does believe in God and gods. But the idea of God with a capital G and gods with a small g, Nietzsche believes in God and gods. Well, what other religious tradition believes in a supreme God and many demigods? Hinduism, specifically Vaishnavism. God is Vishnu. God has many forms, but there's only one monotheistic God, and then there's many subordinate demigods. Shiva and Maya, by the way, it's important to note, are an intermediary form of God. They're not the Vishnu and Lakshmi, this female counterpart of Vishnu, nor are they temporary demigods reincarnating through material bodies. They're eternally in their own eternal forms, Shiva and Maya, because Maya is the shadow of the chit potency of Vishnu, which is Lakshmi. The ultimate form of Lakshmi is Radha. I talk about this in the Brahma Samhita. You can learn that. And Shiva is Krishna's shadow. So Shiva and Maya are this intermediary, the eternal demigods, the only eternal demigods. All right, so section 20, here's what Nietzsche says. He says, yes, my friends, believe with me in Dionysian life and the rebirth of tragedy. The age of the Socratic man is over. You shall accompany the Dionysian pageant from India to Greece. Prepare yourselves for hard strife, but believe in the miracles of your God. All right, so then I'm reviewing here what we have learned so far. So Nietzsche tells us that Dionysus, the miraculous god of tragic culture, travels with a pageant from India to Greece. So he's putting Dionysus in India, embodies Indian Brahmanic culture, that's section 18, and represents a cosmic force that couples reproductively with the cosmic force of his brother Apollo, section 1 and 4, who is, however, according to Nietzsche, the Greek equivalent of Shiva's wife Maya, section 1, but he also mentions Maya in sections 2 and 18, whose veil Nietzsche, following Schopenhauer, equates with Kant's a priori categories of thought, space-time, and causality. He does that equation in section 18. The inborn, empirically unobservable lenses of cognition, which construct the illusory world of phenomenal forms, streaming in through our 5 sense organs from the unknowable thing in itself, das Ding an sich, which is unknowable because we can only perceive it after it has been filtered through and altered radically by the a priori categories of thought. So, here's what Nietzsche says. So Schopenhauer calls the thing in itself the will, which Shankara calls Brahman, which Nietzsche personifies as Dionysus, which he calls, quote, the mysterious original unity in section 1, and which he goes on to call, quote, the only I which truly exists, the eternal I, resting on the ground of things. I meaning self, me, I. So there's only one I, and we're all subordinate emanations of this eternal self. He says that in section 5. And then elsewhere in section 5, talking about Dionysus as the primordial artist of the world, here's another idea of this is just theism that Nietzsche's expressing here. Section 5, the birth of tragedy. Insofar as the subject is the artist, however, he has already been released from his individual will and has become, as it were, the medium through which the only truly existent subject celebrates his release and appearance. The only existing subject is Dionysus. For to our humiliation and exaltation, one thing above all must be clear to us. The entire comedy of art is neither performed for our betterment or education, nor are we the true authors of this art world. Our consciousness of our own significance hardly differs from that which the soldiers painted on canvas have of the battle represented on it. Thus, all of our knowledge of art is basically quite illusory, because as knowing beings, we are not one and identical with that being which, as the sole author and spectator of this comedy of art, prepares a perpetual entertainment for itself. Only insofar as the genius in the act of artistic creation coalesces with this primordial artist of the world does he know anything of the eternal essence of art, for in this state he is, in a marvelous manner, at once subject and object, at once poet, actor, and spectator. So there's one God, there's one artist. And if you as an artist say, I'm going to create something, then you're not really going to create art. But if you as an artist say, I am an emanation of the one supreme self, and you allow that primordial artist of the world to create through you, then you will know what true art is. But the point is, the creator God, he's saying this is, to be a true artist, you must coalesce your will with the will of God. How do you do that? Well, ultimately, he recommends this tragic culture, singing and dancing for the God in a spirit of service and compassionate love. And I'm saying that is identical to Chaitanya's Gaudiya Vaishnava movement, more popularly known as the Hare Krishna movement. And that's what Nietzsche is saying. This is how we're going to reunite with each other and all of nature. And for that matter, all of the universes in the megaverse and the Supreme Being himself. All right, so, and I quote here from the Bhagavad-Gita and the Brahma Samhita, where the relationship between Krishna and Shiva is spelled out, how Shiva is a subordinate expansion from Krishna, and how Maya is the shadow of Krishna's chit potency, and how Radharani, Krishna's lover, is the source of Krishna's chit potency. That's page 24 and 25 of the paper here. If you want to look at those, you can look at those. Radharani and Krishna. That's the female and male side of the supreme God. They each have a shadow side. Krishna's shadow is Shiva, Radha's shadow is Maya. And that led one scholar, Graham Schweig, to refer to the Gaudiya Vaishnava school of Vedanta as, quote, polymorphic bi-monotheism, or many forms of the dual-gendered divinity. All right, so then section 3 of this paper is Joseph Campbell. In the Masks of God creative mythology, he also equates Nietzsche's gods, Dionysus and Apollo, in the Birth of Tragedy, with Indian gods. Like me, he equates Dionysus with Shiva, but he equates Apollo with Vishnu, because he says Vishnu is the Lord of Maya. If Apollo is the veil of Maya, then he represents Vishnu. I'm saying no, Apollo would represent Maya. And that would explain the sexual language that Nietzsche uses for the relationship between Dionysus and Apollo. Vishnu is represented by Heracles, who Nietzsche talks about in sections 10 and 19. And that is what I'm going to move to. So I'm skipping the parts where Kaufman also correlates Dionysus and Apollo with Indian deities. I will, however, read this one from Walter Kaufmann in his famous book, Nietzsche, Philosopher, Psychologist, Antichrist. He analyzes Nietzsche's concept of, and this is Kaufmann's quote, Brahmanic Superman. In Thus Spoke Zarathustra, the Ubermensch, Kaufmann says, is much more like a Brahmin. The Overman is basically a Brahmin. So the Brahmanic Superman, in one section of Thus Spoke Zarathustra called The Dancing Song, Kaufman's, this is a quote, Zarathustra's conception of the dancing god, which invites comparison with the Indian Dionysus, the Shiva Nataraj. So Shiva, there's this famous icon of Shiva in a circle of flames, and he's dancing, and Shiva is a dancing god, which is natural if he's the shadow of Krishna, the ultimate dancing god. And the ultimate dance that Krishna engages in is the Rasa Lila dance. And when Nietzsche describes the dancing song in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, that's a lot more like the Rasa Lila dance between Krishna and the cowherd girls, the gopis, than Shiva's various dances. But I'll get into that in another paper. So here, section 4 of my paper, Nietzsche mentions Heracles in sections 10 and 19. So this is important. Krishna is the god that Nietzsche is worshiping, and Heracles is the mask he uses to refer to Krishna, but he only mentions Heracles 3 times in the whole book, twice in section 10 and once in section 19. But when he does mention Heracles, he mentions him as the source of Dionysus. So I start section 4 talking about that the earliest, so classical philology, and that was Nietzsche's specialty. And that's Greek and Latin, the classical writings of ancient Greece and Rome for the most part. But those classical ancient historians wrote about Alexander the Great's encounters with India. So, such as Megasthenes, Arrian, Strabo, Diodorus, Pliny the Elder, and Philostratus. So here's a quote from J.W. McCrindle's. This is a British Sanskrit philologist. He published this in 1901. Ancient India is described in classical literature. So Nietzsche, as a classical philologist, would have known about this. So here's what McCrindle says. We seldom find classical writers on India failing to mention the legends concerning Bacchus, Prometheus, and Heracles, who is said to have been 15 generations later than Father Bacchus. So Bacchus is another name for Dionysus, the civilizer of India and its first king. Pliny, citing Megasthenes, tells us that from the days of Father Bacchus to Alexander the Great, their kings are reckoned at 154, whose reigns extended over 6,451 years and 3 months. Megasthenes seems to have been the first who began the practice of connecting or identifying the mythic gods or heroes of Indian tradition with the mythic heroes of Greek poetry. In a footnote later, McCrindle, discussing Megasthenes, says, quote, the Indian Hercules is Krishna. So the classical writers talking about Alexander's exploits in India noted that the Indians told Alexander that Heracles and Dionysus had conquered India already before him. First Dionysus and then Heracles. Alexander the Great, in the tradition of Macedonian kings, said he is descended from Heracles. He named his son Heracles. The Greeks told him, yeah, Heracles freed Prometheus from his vultures. So Prometheus was chained up to a rock by Zeus for stealing fire from the gods and giving it to the human species that he created. And Heracles worked out a bargain with his father Zeus to free Prometheus from his chains, which is an important point in the birth of tragedy. So I'm saying here that even an average classical philologist would have known that the classical writers talked about Heracles and Dionysus were said by the Indians to have performed their exploits in India, as well as Prometheus. And those are the myths that Nietzsche talks about. So in the foreword to Richard Wagner, which ends with the word Basel, end of 1871, so in Switzerland, the end of 1871, the foreword to Richard Wagner, the Romantic composer, who was a friend of Nietzsche's, sort of a father figure. Here's what Nietzsche, he's basically dedicating the book to Wagner. And here's a quote in that foreword. Nietzsche says, he imagines what my, quote, highly esteemed friend will receive this book as you perhaps after an evening walk in the winter snow contemplate the unbound Prometheus on the title page, read my name, and are immediately convinced that whatever this book might contain, the author has something serious and pressing to say. So Smith explains in his note, he says, in referring to his name on the title page as that of an unbound Prometheus, Nietzsche is casting himself in the mythic role of a liberated rather than imprisoned rebel against an unjust order. The implication is that the writing of the book itself is to be construed as a liberating act of rebellion. Nietzsche identifies himself with Prometheus unbound. Heracles unbound Prometheus. So Nietzsche sees himself as being liberated by Heracles. So that's important to keep in mind because in section 10, in section 9, Nietzsche calls Prometheus an Aryan god. He's the archetypal god of the Aryans. Aryan is a word referring to the Indian Brahmanic culture. Then in section 10, Nietzsche explains how the myth of Prometheus was dying, but then through the musical art of tragedy, it was brought back to life. So using mythological terms, Nietzsche says that Prometheus was, quote, freed from his vultures to become a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom by the Heracleian power of music. All right, so the Heracleian power of music. Then I get into where Nietzsche talks about, he quotes Schopenhauer, says that music expresses as an unmediated art of the underlying will. The Apollinian arts of individual form, like painting and sculpture, represent the illusory forms arising from the underlying will. So they're twice removed from reality, whereas music represents the will itself. And he he says, the will also contains the eternal ideas that Plato talks about, the eternal forms of knowledge from which all of the imperfect copies radiate, the absolutely perfect exemplars in the mind of God. That's what music provides. And I'm not going to get into the details that I write about so much, but I will read this. Nietzsche quotes Volume 1 of Schopenhauer's World as Will and Representation. So this is a footnote 48 on page 34. So here's what Schopenhauer says about music and its relationship to the eternal forms. So this relation may be very well expressed in the language of the schoolmen. That's the scholastics beginning with St. Thomas Aquinas, by saying the concepts are the universalia post-rem, but music gives the universalia ante-rem, and the real world the universalia in re. So Richard Tarnas, a cultural historian in The Passion of the Western Mind, he says Aquinas, using distinctions formulated by Albert Magnus, strove to resolve the dispute between Aristotle's and Plato's concepts of the absolute ideas that form the material world. He strove to resolve the dispute by suggesting that the ideas had three kinds of existence: as exemplars in the mind of God, independent of things, ante-rem; as intelligible forms in things, in re, that's what Aristotle was talking about; and as concepts in the human mind, formed by abstracting from things post-rem. The point is, music represents the absolute ideas in the mind of God. Those ideas in the mind of God are specifically described by the schoolmen as existing out at the outermost sphere of the cosmos. And Nietzsche talks about the same thing, which I will discuss in another paper. But the point is, the spirit of music represents the absolute ideas in the mind of God. The spirit of music, it's not so much of a stretch to say God is the spirit of music. And therefore, music can bring out the archetypal meaning of anything, any scene. So in a commercial, an example that I use is if you look at political commercials. So if one political party wants to put forth its candidate, then they have in the background uplifting and harmonious and enlivening music. And then they show the opponent, and then it's menacing music and it's evil. And I say, you could have the same exact two pictures, and both political parties could use the exact same two pictures and the exact same background music with no words, and just simply switch which music plays when one face or the other is being shown. So you got a Republican and a Democrat. The Republicans would show the Republican with uplifting music, and he's going to save us, and the Democrat, oh, sinister, and vice versa. The Democrat show the Republican face, oh, watch out, and then the Democrat, So why is it that music can so concisely represent the underlying archetypal meaning of things? And it's because music is a direct representation of the underlying will, which consists of all of the absolute ideas in God's mind. So it's a complicated philosophical point, and I want to get back on the main point. Well, in section 16, Nietzsche says, music is, unlike sculpture and painting, which are imitations of forms coming out of the will, music, the Dionysian art form, the Apollonian plastic arts, painting and sculpture. The Dionysian art of music is, quote, section 16, an unmediated copy of the will itself, and therefore complements everything physical in the world and every phenomenon by representing what is metaphysical, the thing in itself. We might therefore just as call the world embodied music as embodied will. Okay, so the world is embodied music. Nietzsche talks about the Heracleian power of music, who saved Prometheus from his vultures, and made him a vehicle for Dionysian wisdom. All right, and then I'm going to read that whole quote, but later in section 10, Nietzsche talks about how Euripides was infected by the Socratic spirit of over-rationalization, which killed the artistic instincts of the Dionysian and Apollonian impulses. And then here's a quote. Nietzsche says in section 10, and then you needed a copied masked myth that, like the ape of Heracles, merely knew how to deck itself out in the ancient pomp. So if a masked myth, a fake tragic myth that Euripides was giving, although Nietzsche points out Euripides' final play, the Bacchae, is the archetype of the tragic art form, but his other myths, Nietzsche's criticizing as being influenced by Socrates to use reason to kill these instinctive artistic impulses. So a masked myth is the ape of Heracles. The implication is that true myth is Heracles himself. And we know Heracles is important because Nietzsche says that Heracles freed Prometheus from his vultures. And Nietzsche identifies himself with Prometheus unbound. So this has got to be important to him. And he knew from reading Christian Lassen, and I'm sure others, that the ancient Greeks equated Heracles with Krishna. So in section 18, we saw he equated tragic culture with Indian Brahmanic culture. Now he's in section 10. This is before section 18. He's saying a masked myth is the ape of Heracles. Well, then a true myth is Heracles himself, which would make sense of why he said that the Heracleian power of music freed Prometheus from his vultures and made him the Aryan god Prometheus and made him a vehicle for Dionysian wisdom. All right, so now I'm going to read it, section 10, more completely here. My alarm is going to go off in 1 minute because I have a conference call. I'm going to knock it when it comes off, and then a few more minutes, and then I'm going to shut this down. So here it is in section 10, putting together all of the mentions of Heracles in section 10. So Nietzsche says, what power was it that freed Prometheus from his vultures and transformed the myth into a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom? It is the Heracleian power of music. Having reached its highest manifestation in tragedy, it can invest myths with a new and most profound significance. What did you want, sacrilegious Euripides, when you sought to compel this dying myth to serve you once more? It died under your violent hands, and then you needed a copied, masked myth that, like the ape of Heracles, merely knew how to deck itself out in the ancient pomp. So, the Heracleian power of music freed Prometheus from his vultures and made him a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom. To become a vehicle of Dionysian wisdom, it implies that Dionysian wisdom comes from the Heracleian power of music. All right, now in section 19, Nietzsche links the Dionysian spirit with Heracles. Section 19, the birth of tragedy. What hopes must revive in us when the most certain auspices guarantee the reverse process, the gradual awakening of the Dionysian spirit in our modern world? It is impossible that the divine strength of Heracles should languish forever in ample bondage to Omphale. So Omphale was the widowed queen of Lydia. I'll talk about her in the next video. But the point here is this. The divine strength of Heracles is languishing. When it stops languishing, then the Dionysian spirit will awaken in our modern world. Why does the Dionysian spirit awakening depend on the strength of Heracles to cease its languishing in luxurious slavery to Omphale? It implies that the Dionysian spirit is a subordinate manifestation of Heracles. The Dionysian spirit is the strength of Heracles. So, and then I'm going to go on here in section 19. Let me just read here. So, as in section 10, where it was the, quote, Heracleian power of music that transformed the myth of Prometheus into a, quote, vehicle of Dionysian wisdom, so too in section 19 does the awakening of the Dionysian spirit depend on and apparently emanate from the divine strength of Heracles. The logic of those two sentences from sections 19 indicates that the divine strength of Heracles is the Dionysian spirit, so that when Heracles ceases languishing, Dionysus gradually awakens, the imminence of whose arousal indicates that modern Europe seems, quote, to be passing backward from the Alexandrian age to the period of tragedy. So the implication, I say, is that as Alexander the Great and the Greeks conquered parts of India to establish Socratic scientific Alexandrian culture, now European converts to Indian Brahmanic culture, i.e. tragic culture, will conquer Greece, which symbolizes the entire Western civilization born from that cradle. All right, so that is the evidence equating Dionysus with Shiva and Heracles with Krishna and Apollo with Maya. And I'll leave it at that. And in the next section, I will talk about a letter that Nietzsche wrote in response to the attacks that he received from other philologists who did not understand the birth of tragedy. And that will be in another paper or another video.